So I did want to just say that, stroke is a very important disease. Every year, there's 795,000 new cases of stroke annually. 2018 was the most recent data that I could find. Every 40 seconds, someone in the U.S. has a stroke, and a stroke kills someone every 3 minutes and 33 seconds. It's the 5th leading cause of death in the United States, down from 3rd when I started working with stroke. 2nd leading cause of death globally, and the leading cause of disability in the U.S. And of course, disability is what most of our patients fear, actually. The annual cost to society is $34 billion. This is not just in terms of stroke care, but also long-term care and loss of productivity related to stroke. So back in 2013, we were in a situation where we were doing a lot of clinical trials on stroke, but they were taking a long time to complete, and they cost a lot of money. A lot of the delay in getting these trials done was in terms of regulation. These trials may be being done at hundreds of different sites across the world, and each site would have its own regulatory process, its own institutional review board that had to review the study and then would negotiate its own contract with the sponsors. And many of the studies also had poor enrollment. And one example of this was the IMS study, or Interventional Management of Stroke, which was actually reported in 2013. This study had been ongoing for 9 years before it was stopped for futility. And, one of the criticisms of this was when they had started the trial, they used what at the time was the most current treatments. But by the time the study had ended, those treatments were really outdated. And even though they were trying to incorporate new technology as the trial went along, the vast majority of patients in that trial had been treated with technology that was no longer being used, and therefore not very helpful. So what the NIH wanted to do was it wanted to figure out a way to do these trials in a more efficient manner so that they would enroll patients more quickly, they could do it cheaper, and that they would have results in a time frame that they were still relevant. So it created StrokeNet. So the mission statement is that it created StrokeNet to facilitate the development, the promotion, and the conduct of high-quality multi-site clinical trials focused on key interventions in 3 areas: stroke prevention, stroke treatment, and recovery. And this was going to be accomplished by having 25 regional coordinating centers. And those would be, if you will, sort of shovel-ready sites that were experienced at conducting clinical trials, and they thought they'd enroll a lot of patients and be able to really get the trials moving quickly. They would use master trial agreements. So instead of each site negotiating its own contract, a contract would be done with one site, and that would apply to all of the sites. And it would use a central IRB that would review the trial, and then all of the coordinating centers would agree to use that IRB as the IRB of record. So it wouldn't go through its own individual institutional review boards. And this was going to save a lot of regulatory time and contract negotiation time. And so that was, and the trials would get done quicker and they'd be cheaper. And that was the plan. So when the RFA came out for this, we at UH were looking to submit a grant, which we thought would be really just for UH. And it turns out that Ken Uchino at the Cleveland Clinic was also planning to submit a grant that would be for the Cleveland Clinic. But when we went through the RFA, we realized that only one application would be accepted per site. And while Ken and I think of our hospitals as being distinct entities, the NIH does not. And the NIH considers UH, Cleveland Clinic, Metro, and the VA to be all Case Western Reserve University. And it became clear that we could not both submit a separate application. And so we decided to collaborate and also to pull in the other hospitals that were part of CASE. So I have to say that writing this grant was a very different experience from any other grant writing experience I've ever had. For me, grant writing in the past had always meant sort of shutting your office door and becoming one with your computer. And it was a very sort of isolated experience. However, this was completely different. First, I did this little tour of the city. We had to sell the idea. I had a PowerPoint, and we went to all of these different hospitals in Cleveland, although I think I never actually physically went to the VA. I think I just met with Svetlana Pundik from the VA somewhere else. But, we had to go to these other hospitals, see if they wanted to participate and get them on board, explain what StrokeNet was. And it wasn't really just the hospitals. We also had to talk with the IRBs in the different hospitals, make sure that they would agree to use a central IRB. We had to make sure that our hospital would accept a master trial agreement for the contract. We had to talk with different departments because they really needed us to have expertise not only in neurology, but in neurosurgery, emergency medicine, vascular surgery, the different areas which are all involved in management and prevention of stroke. And then, of course, we had to have the hospital administration for each of these hospitals sign off on participation. And so that grant writing experience, even the actual writing of it was different because Ken and I literally would be on the phone for, I think, hours, Ken, writing this. I think Ken is a night person and I'm a morning person. So I'd be writing the grant and then I'd send him the version and he'd revise it while I was sleeping. And then we just would go back and forth like this. And so it was really was a very interactive experience that I wasn't really used to, but was kind of fun.
Can I ask, how long did it take from the time that you realized that this was how you had to do it? How long did it take you to get other people on board and to get this written?
So I'm not sure I remember I remember talking about the grant at the stroke meeting, which would have been in February. And I think the grant was due in September. Is that right, Ken? And it was probably March it was probably March. It wasn't long before we realized we couldn't do it separately.
That's quite a revelation.
Don't seem to be actually using it effectively.
Yeah, it was a long, drawn out process. I mean, it required a lot of forethought. It wasn't something you were just going to be able to put together in a short period of time because there were so many parts to it.
Understood. Thanks.
And so in the end, we submitted this grant with the 4 hospitals and we got funded, which was very exciting.
Farm. No, I said farm. No, I said a farm.
All right. So one of the things that is kind of key to this grant is the master trial agreement. So I thought I would let Dave talk about this.
Sure. And so I'd like everybody on the call just to keep in mind that the StrokeNet grant itself is, as Sophie alluded to earlier, is different than a group of trials. Even though StrokeNet has a steady pipeline of acute prevention and rehab trials, the key to the StrokeNet grant is about setting up an infrastructure of different institutions to collaborate together. And so I kind of think of the master trial agreement, if you will, as a horse with a bridle. And on each side of the bridle is a rein. One rein is the master trial agreement, and the other rein is going to be the reliance agreement that I'll talk about in just a minute. But between those two devices, that's what deploys how well the collaborative works, at least for in our regional coordinating area. So when CASE became a site, it was a regional coordinating area for Cleveland Clinic, Metro, the VA, and university hospitals. And so basically, the layman term for a master trial agreement is a legal document that is agreed upon between an outside institution and a coordinating center or site. But for a lot of us that are in research, it's a lot different than a clinical trial agreement. A clinical trial agreement is where you have a budget and you either have milestone payments that go into that budget, or you have a set budget for equipment and things like that. But this master trial agreement is designed to keep people and institutions together. So as Sophie said before, that one of the things was to speed up trials. And so if they could have a steady stream of groups of institutions from around the country, but even within those groups, as in our 4 institutions, we have a set of PIs that run the grant, and we have PIs that are associated with each of the institutions, and then their research coordinating group and grant managers and so on and so forth. That's what this master trial agreement binds everyone to. It identifies those players and puts them in a group together. So that's the first part of it. And then the second is that it reduces negotiations because there's a set price for F&A, for instance. And so that, and for all trials coming through. So there's no real wiggle room for going through each individual institution through legal, which used to be a time stopper for a lot of people. I know that at 2 of the institutions, sometimes legal contracts would go through for quite a while, 6 months to 9 months, maybe even a year. With this, it has actually shortened that period of time because of the master trial agreement. The master trial agreements, as I mentioned, are sort of time sensitive, and that there's an advantage for that in that between 3 and 5 years, it allows for everyone to get the infrastructure set up within an institution. But it's short enough too to allow then at that time period when the trial agreement is exhausted for institutions or the regional coordinating center like CASE to go back and renegotiate if necessary. So that's the master trial agreement for our group. The one thing that I would say about clinical trial agreements versus a master trial agreement is that one is a contract and it's study specific for studies. A master trial agreement in this sense right here was really for the infrastructure of our regional coordinating center. So that's the one side of the ring that helps to keep all of our institutions together and to make them equal players within the group. But then the other part of this is a reliance agreement. And generally, kind of as a background to this, we're all familiar with what an IRB is and that we have to submit to an IRB for research. And IRBs generally have 3 types of research that they look at: exempt, expedited, and full reviews. But in this situation, since we have 4 institutions, and actually now with our regional coordinating center, we have 9 institutions, we have to work through some other IRB. So then it becomes an IRB that is of the relying IRB. In the situation with StrokeNet, that is Cincinnati, the National Coordinating Center, and we rely on their central IRB. So there's a document called a reliance agreement. It's a formal document that provides, as you can see the definition there, a mechanism for an institution engaged in research to delegate their IRB to an independent IRB or another institution. And that's what's happened here with StrokeNet. We signed this reliance agreement, and all the institutions together signed this agreement then to use another IRB, in this case Cincinnati, for the StrokeNet, as to be their relying IRB. Now, what does happen many a times is that when we do use this reliant IRB, our institution still may require a review of the IRB that, even though we are relying on one and been signed off as a legal document, they may want to review that again. And so that will go through an expedited review most times in that situation. So sometimes we're able to shorten the length of time that we would go through an IRB using a central IRB, but it's not always the case. We can go to the next slide. And so those are the 2 reins that I talked about that keep all 4 of our institutions, or now 9 of our institutions, together The other part of this is just a review of what the NIH was looking for when they created StrokeNet, and it also then comes down to the Regional Coordinating Center, or CASE. So the NIH, or NINS, uses several metrics to measure the success of StrokeNet. One is to take a look at the number of trials that have come through the pipeline for StrokeNet itself. But then on a regional coordinating center, as those trials are released, we're also measured about how well and how much we're participating on those trials. So in our situation here with 4 hospitals, we would want to be doing several of the trials that are coming through the pipeline. Study startup timeframes, which is something that Dr. Sundarajan had mentioned as one of the goals in getting time condensed shorter for IRB approvals and for financing. And so StrokeNet, that was one of the goals, and that's how we're measured as well. For each of our institutions, we're making sure that that time frame is being met. Then the key is obviously not only that we have trials in the system on a national level, but are we randomizing and getting these trials finished? And on a couple of occasions, the trials actually finished early and ahead of schedule, which for many of you on the call might be kind of surprising because a lot of times industry trials run terribly behind schedule. But in this instance, we had a few of them that were right on target or ahead of schedule. But then on a regional coordinating center, we're also measured about how well we enroll. And every 5 years, the National Institute of Health and NINS look at how well the RCC case is doing for the number of trials, its time frame, and its randomizations. And then, of course, as usual, retention of subjects, data capturing, and reporting are also measures that are measured not only on a national level, but also on a regional level. Next slide, please. So we talk about all the different trials that are going on, and Dr. Sundarajan mentioned that there were 25 sites that were originally started with StrokeNet. At the renewal, 4 sites were not renewed, but they stayed on as what we call legacy sites. And then we had a few independent sites, and just recently, the network has expanded to international as well. There are 13 current active trials, or trials, I should say, within StrokeNet, and some of them are listed down below. This slide here shows just a quick dashboard of those measurements and metrics that are used in study related. And here on the one side, you can see the number of institutions that are listed. Now, when I say NIH, StrokeNet, and recognized trials, some of these trials had started prior to the infrastructure of StrokeNet. Within the first year or two, there was no new pipeline of StrokeNet, pure StrokeNet trials. So there was some of these recognized trials that were out there, such as down below Misty 3, Rhapsody, Point, Shine, High Def, and let me see, I think that's it. So those trials were up and running during the very beginning of StrokeNet when there was no steady pipeline of new trials coming out. But since that time, these other trials have been. And so we have a daily report or a monthly report that goes through as well. And this is the study progress. And you can see cases right in the middle right now for recruitment. Next slide, please. We can also just take a look at what the pure StrokeNet trials were. I mentioned that there was some that were there beforehand, but these trials listed down below right now, and there are 13, I think, active trials right now. So High Def, IDEF, Telerehab, diffuse, as you can see, Sleep Smart, Arcadia CSI. And these are recruitment numbers per institution. So again, you see CASE is now not right necessarily in the middle of the pack, but on the lower quarter of that lower end right there. So that's just our progress reports in the way of metrics being used with the NIH to measure our RCC's progress. So the next slide.
Oops. So
did you want to talk about the Arcadia trial?
Well, Arcadia is one of the trials in StrokeNet. All of the trials themselves have separate funding. And, this particular, for Arcadia, there are 5 of our sites that are participating in Arcadia. And, not all of them have enrolled. 4 of the 5 have enrolled. each site has different numbers of patients that they have enrolled, and for our RCC, we add those all together for our numbers. Next slide. So some things that we have found are helpful to make the collaborative work. Certainly in the beginning, when we just had sites within Cleveland, we used to have dinners where we would meet and discuss what was going on. That became a little.
Yeah, well, as we expanded, not just within Cleveland, but other sites, including as far as Grand Rapids, Michigan, to the north and west, and Pittsburgh at Allegheny General Hospital, West Virginia University, and within Ohio Health in Columbus, and St. Vincent's Health Center in Toledo. It's a sort of annual sort of meeting in person became more challenging or semi-annual. So we have done more remotely, especially in the past year during the pandemic. So that we have implemented, and that's the network, or within our sort of regional coordinating center, the network expanded.
And I will say, Kat, if I could just add in on that, that's really one of the questions was, how do we make the collaborative work in Cleveland? And as to those outside institutions that you mentioned as well, because we're all competing institutions, and yet we make it work because of all these different deployments here that we have on the slide right here, that semi-annual meeting. We would have one as an in-person meeting and one as a phone meeting. The quarterly calls are all of the sites that are invited to attend the call, and we have those site PIs on. But then we also do individual calls, especially after COVID. That was a great time to not only find out how individual sites are doing, but a lot of times sites themselves, they may want to be a little bit more candid on the individual calls if there's some issues going on with that site and the regional coordinating center. So it's a great time for just a one-on-one call with Ken Eugenio, Sophie, and myself with those sites. And then the on-site visits as well have been very beneficial. So I think between all of these and then the regular, I stay in contact with all of the different sites on a regular basis, and it's almost weekly, if not monthly. So I think that all of these different strategies help keep the communications very, very tight for our StrokeNet group.
So communication is the key for keeping people engaged and keeping these moving forward.
It always is. It's that one that they always say, communications. So.
I think also, but to be honest, I think that it's communication, but it's a challenge also. There are these network sites, and there are sort of site representatives that are the person, but the person who is the site PI for the clinical trial might be a different person. So in a sense, it's more indirect to us. So having everyone engaged at this remote site, or knowing how engaged they are, it's sometimes difficult. And so I think that's one of the realities I want to mention.
Right.
So interaction frequently helps to suss that out, I would imagine.
Yes,
it does. And I think that the PI that we have selected so far, maybe we've been very lucky, but they've been very engaged. There's somebody on the call that says that PI does not mean practically invisible, but instead is, somebody who is fully engaged. And so I think that most of our PIs that I've experienced right now and working with all the institutions, they are engaged. They will attend our calls and attend our meetings, and are very responsive when we reach out to them.
Can I ask a logistic question? So when you approach the different institutions or PIs of the different institutions, is this StrokeNet viewed as collaboration at the PI level or institution and institutional level? Do you know what I mean?
I do. Ken, do you want to take that one or do you want me to?
It's a program I think collaboration. I'm not sure whether we.
Maybe I should rephrase that. I mean, seems like to me that the PI collaboration among all these institutions in brain health or neuroscience seems like there's no problem. But when you get into the institutional level, there is always this question, what's it for me?
Yeah.
So I would like to, learn more about how.
Yeah, I feel that the institution has been institutions have been supportive. I have not felt any sort of barriers. I think it's being on the NIH StrokeNet and being part of the network has been encouraged. But what makes it work? Yes, it's the PI level. And when the application goes in, it's we sort of make sure that as a stroke program, yes, we are strong, or our other participant sites, we have to present the stroke program that is solid and will participate. And we have gotten letters of support from the center director, neurological institute chair for the application. But in practicality, I think it's the PIs.
Do the PIs site PIs have an opportunity to participate in committees at the national level, whatever committee it might be?
Yes.
Or join writing groups, like if they're going to write up the primary paper or even secondary analyses, are they able to join those writing groups so that they feel engaged? This was in Sprint, there was a lot of pressure to join committees, as well as to, each network wanted to be represented on basically every paper. So, and that was by signing up. And so you had to stay,
Yes, so just keep in mind that StrokeNet is not the clinical trial. So if you are the clinical trial PI and enroll well, yes, there's opportunity for that the trial publication and the secondary publications, and but it's not sort of directly on the stroke. It's true of any sort of clinical trial, NIH funded trials, to have such participation in whether that in the tradition. So NIH is trying to put NDS is trying to put all sort of clinical trials, phase 2 and beyond, onto StrokeNet. So pretty much all NINDS stroke trials are at this point on the network. So what have been done traditionally, I think, still the same. Within the StrokeNet, there are committees. So there are working groups in acute stroke prevention and recovery. Those are the three main areas of StrokeNet trials. And there's working groups that take rotating terms, and there's also the education as well. So there are rotating members, and people within the network have the opportunity to be on the committees. So some of the working group duties is to review the proposed trials and not serve as a study, study section review, but really to advise, feasibility, and send out to the whole network to gauge sort of interest and report back to the clinical trial PIs that are proposing and giving some sort of direction priorities within these areas.
Thank you. It's very helpful.
So I think from UH, I think Kathy Seiler had been on the acute stroke working group, and Osama Zaidat has been on the at St. Vincent's Health Center, has been on the endovascular working group.
Mm-hmm. Sure. No, some well. Do you pay the PIs? Is there salary for the PIs?
So, Sophia, I think you're on mute.
Oh, we have a small amount of salary support, but it's really very little. I think it's like 5%.
That's a little.
Yeah, it's not much, but the total amount of the grant for this, because it's really just for the infrastructure, is only like $150,000. It's not very much.
And there is I think we didn't mention, but there's also an educational component to the StrokeNet. So each RCC supports StrokeNet fellows each year, young postdocs, fellows, junior faculty who will be supported 1 year and dedicate 50% of time to research. And there's money allocated for that.
So now this raises an interesting question for me as well, and that is it a fellow at Cleveland Clinic? Is it a fellow at UH? How is that determined? Is there a committee that chooses who they're going to be? How do you deal with it?
So we submit, we request applications, and we have a committee of several members throughout our RCC who review those applications and choose the candidate. So far, we've had people receive that from UH, from the Cleveland Clinic, and from Metro.
Got it. Thank you.
I think one of the keys, and somebody had asked us before, is, was a PI related? And I think part of it is yes to that answer, to making this collaboration work. And I think the other part is the master trial agreement that we talked about earlier, where each one that enters into the relationship with the regional coordinating center has equal footing and has equal representation, just as in what Sophie was just talking about now with the choosing of the candidates. Even though 3 of the candidates came from the Cleveland area, we did have a couple candidates express interest from outside areas as well, such as West Virginia is one of my examples that I can think of off the top of my head. So I think that it's a little of all of these ingredients that we're talking about that make this collaboration work. But I think the master trial agreement is very instrumental in bringing all the institutions together, because that was one of the questions that I'm hearing is, how do you get these institutions to work together, not just the PIs? And I think that this is one of those mechanisms.
So it sounds as though, StrokeNet is really the backbone on which all clinical trials for stroke in this area take place. And that if you want to be part of that clinical trial and you want to be able to be seen as moving forward the field of treatment of patients with stroke, you really have to be part of this. I wonder if you are, constantly getting requests from people who are not participating, from hospital systems that have not been part of it in the past that want to join, or if you think you pretty much have the core group of academic centers with you already.
Well, that's why we started at 4 and we ended up with the current number because the hospital systems wanted to join. So yes.
Yeah, I don't think it was I don't think it was our vision at first to have 9. I think it was just going to be the 4 in Cleveland.
Right. That was the original idea. But yeah, so there are industry sponsored stroke trials that are not going through StrokeNet, but pretty much all of the NIH stroke trials are going through StrokeNet. And so yes, if you want to participate in those, you really have to pretty much be associated with StrokeNet.
And just to the question that you asked as well, I think part of the mindset of NINS is to see how well StrokeNet is doing and use this as a model for other disease entities in the near future. So I don't see StrokeNet as being, as a novel concept, but still, I think other areas outside of stroke and brain health, pulmonary or GI, I think they're all starting to gravitate towards the same area as StrokeNet in that model.
Well, that's actually very interesting because, from our point of view, like we look at the different diseases have their different, funding areas. We have the CADRC, the Alzheimer's Disease Research Center here now in Cleveland. But, do you think that it could be applicable to like a Parkinson's net? So that you have these interdisciplinary, interinstitutional agreements so that you can be part of these. I'm sure that there are fewer probably clinical research studies that are specific to diseases in the CNS as opposed to stroke, which is huge. But.
Well, there is the Parkinson's study group. There's the Huntington study group. There's the Alzheimer's Clinical Trials Consortium, which is different than the ADRC program, even if it's all the same people. And most of these do not go through NINDS, which maybe there are some issues with NINDS compared to other institutes and how they go about supporting research.
Yeah, some of the disease-based networks are geared more toward industry funded, is my understandings, and
yes and no.
Yes and no. Okay. And there is NeuroNext that was for more general neurology wide, except stroke. That created similar network, and there is.
Could I ask
for emergency medicine network? Siren.
Chip, could I ask a question along these same lines? How much interest is there in StrokeNet in the treatment of the cognitive symptoms associated with stroke? And also, of course, there are vast networks of centers in psychiatry. How much collaboration is there between any psychiatric centers, for example, the ones that focus on older folks, and your StrokeNet with regards to the behavioral symptoms associated with stroke?
So to answer your first question, I think there's a lot of interest in looking at vascular dementia and cognitive outcomes from stroke. The Arcadia trial that we mentioned earlier does have sort of a sister trial, Arcadia CSI, which is to look at cognitive outcomes. And we have patients enrolled in that study as well. And so there is a lot of interest. I mean, vascular dementia is a pretty hot topic right now.
Except I have to say, whether it's because it's going to other networks or other parts of NIH, we haven't really seen sort of many sort of cognition and or post-stroke or vascular dementia or post-stroke cognition trials being proposed and come through.
And anything about psychiatry connections with the NIMH?
I don't know about connections with the NIMH.
If there's been more sort of a talk about the network connection that's been more sort of global, the international sort of collaboration into different countries and networks. So I haven't heard much about sort of
Yeah,
different
and
disease.
speaking of international, I've just written a paper with Vladimir Hachinsky about brain health. Are you guys tracking the One Neurology movement, which is really all about trying to create a global movement to foster brain health called One Neurology?
I'm not familiar with that.
Not either.
It's probably worthwhile tracking. It's at high levels, WHO, UN, that kind of thing. It's all about bringing visibility to what we were talking about earlier, brain health conditions more generally.
Well, let me posit this. We've all been so engaged and we're barraging you with questions. I'm not entirely sure that you finished your presentation. Was there more that you wanted to say that we should just kind of hold ourselves back for a minute and let you finish, or?
Well, we did have some more slides, but I think a lot of what's on those slides is, in many ways similar to what we've been talking about. I mean, some of what we identified as strengths and weaknesses within our own regional coordinating center. Initially we thought we had a really great idea because all of our sites were close, and now we have these far away sites. And that, I'll admit that was a factor in our renewal. That was something the reviewers actually didn't like, was that we had these sites that were far away, and how would we get them to contribute? We've worked to have good relationships with our sites. We, unlike a lot of sites in our RC, a lot of sites within StrokeNet, that trainee award is going to one institution, and it's kind of hard sometimes to explain to people that we don't have complete control over that. I can't say who in UH is going to get this award, that it may not go to a UH person. I will point out that our Cleveland VA is serving as a regulatory advisor for all VA sites nationally. With increased numbers of sites within our RCC, we thought that would just, count for more and more recruitment. What we didn't realize, I think, at the time was that they were also looking at our recruitment for the number of beds in our RCC. And so in reality, it may not have helped us so much because some of our more distant sites are not recruiting as well. One factor is, since the NIH was looking to reduce its costs for clinical trials, the budgets for many of these trials are extremely tight. And in fact, when you complain about them, you often hear that we're supposed to do this for the glory of doing the studies, which is all very well when you're doing one or two NIH trials. But I think one thing that StrokeNet has done is to concentrate a lot of NIH trials in one site, which kind of disrupts your balance between your industry studies, which tend to pay well, and your NIH studies, which pay poorly, and has caused a great deal of financial worries in many of our sites within our RCC. This is not unique to our RCC. This is something being seen throughout StrokeNet. And then the other thing on here is our study startup time has actually been fairly long compared to other sites. And one of the things that we found out is because of our Reliant agreement, and because 4 of those sites are going through Case Western Reserve, Case Western Reserve does not approve the study startup until all the sites are ready. And so our times are only as good as our weakest link for our case associated sites, which has been an issue for us. I don't know if Ken or Dave wanted to comment on any of those points.
I'll add that one of the strengths that we found within our group was best practice ideas as well. We found that some of the studies that we had going, the study teams from each of the institutions the ones that were recruiting well were sharing some of their strategies and how they were screening for patients that helped other institutions who were struggling. And even among the PIs, I know Sophie and Ken, you guys addressed in the Arcadia example that you pulled out for the group, but BNP was something that was considered an exclusionary point, but talking between the institutions, they were able to figure out a better way of approaching that particular obstacle. And so it's something that I think brought the institutions together a little bit, at least for the study teams, because I know the study managers will often call me and share with each other some of these strategies. And that was one of the points I thought might be worth hearing.
Okay.
Can I ask, have you considered maybe reducing your number of sites, or would that just be catastrophic to the individual sites?
So we are looking at that. We are going to have to submit another renewal in 2022. And that is one of the things we will be looking at each site. How much are they actually contributing? And if they're not contributing, we are probably going to have to reduce the number of sites and take some of them out.
Have you talked to Case Western about what sounds like an archaic approach to reliant review, which is bad enough to begin with, even at its best, but this to wait for everybody, this makes absolutely no sense, except that they don't want to just meet a lot.
Yeah, we have talked to them several times, and it took us a while to figure out what the delay was, before we found out that, they haven't approved us because they're waiting for Metro. Ken, do you want to comment on that some more?
Yeah, and just to clarify, it's not the IRB review, but it's the sort of the administrative part, right?
Yeah.
Well,
correct.
Yeah, I mean, it's still eating up valuable time.
Right.
And
talk to.
And the later you start, the fewer people you do. You especially with competitive enrollments, which always have this sigmoid shape, and so the closer you are to when it just zooms up at the end, many fewer patients are going to get recruited, and it builds on itself.
Yeah.
So
negative way.
I think, as I mentioned earlier, communication is the key, and sort of, I think, communication, chasing where the bottlenecks are appears to be the only solution. Yeah.
Maybe Lynn or Eleni can look into this further. This is really a terrible bottleneck that they've created.
No, cases were created.
Well, CBHI, if to the extent that CBHI has any influence with case administration, you've identified a major bottleneck in study approval and participation. Wouldn't make me want to.
Yeah, I agree. This StrokeNet is a good model for us to study more, to set up something interinstitutional.
The other part I want to mention in terms of sort of competing, collaborating institutions, I think we have had examples where there was a rehabilitation trial that was done, only sort of few sites, not all 25 sites across the country participated in a smaller phase 2 study, and was done at Metro. But we referred from here. So we, in a sense, yes, clinically the institution may be competing, but at the clinician level and researcher level, and I think especially rehabilitation program, they actively screen and referred, and I also referred some from Cleveland Clinic as well to that.
We did extremely well in that trial. We were the third highest recruiter in the nation, our RCC, and those patients were being referred from different hospitals throughout Cleveland to the Metro site for that trial.
And the rehabilitation is beyond the standard clinical rehabilitation, and so there's no, it's something we're able to offer for the patients, and patients are happy, and as long as they met the criteria.
And
Well, that's fantastic. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say I may have missed it while I was having my technical issues, but I know one of the things Ken had brought up when we were talking about this talk was that even though the institution sort of signed off on this idea of the central IRB and the master trial agreements, by the time the trials were really coming down the pipe, a lot of those people who signed off on it were no longer the people making decisions. And I know at the Cleveland Clinic, they've been having to go through a separate IRB in addition to the central IRB. Is that right, Ken?
Yeah, at least at our institution, yes, they agree for Reliant IRB, and in principle, they don't have a problem with it. They still want the full submission locally, and a little bit more extra explaining about the Cincinnati IRB, and there are instances where the central IRB, the consent form had the patient's name and the phone number in the first page, and our sort of legal didn't like that. Our standard is not to put the patient's name and especially the phone number on the first page. So they felt that they had to review these details of privacy and such at our institution's level. So there was, and of course the central, Cincinnati was, well, this is our thing, we don't have to change. So there was a little bit of these small things that, it's supposed to be efficient, but we end up submitting to two IRBs in a sense.
Okay. So, every place has their own culture. Every place has their own way of doing things. And then they say that they're fine with the central IRB, but in effect, you end up doing things twice, maybe. But still better than the alternative, I would imagine, which is that every place has to do its own, which takes you right out of StrokeNet anyway. So,
right.
I was going to say too that,
yeah,
with these delays that we had, StrokeNet for all the new institutions that we brought on was brand new to every institution. And so the very first time that it had to go through their legals and their grant department and their IRB, they were asking, who's StrokeNet? What is this about? What did we sign up for? And it wasn't until after the first probably trial or two at each of these institutions that we start to now see the speed now improve. Before it was chronically delayed, and now we're starting to see where even with some of the delays that we had before, when we work through these processes, now we're starting to see a much better response. So I think overall it's improving, but it all depends on how well each of the hospitals are using StrokeNet on a regular basis in order to get it through.
That's great. So you are appreciated at some point. People do get how important it is. But I imagine with people changing jobs and, changes that it must be a little frustrating to have to kind of prove it again. But the only thing I've ever heard about StrokeNet is how incredibly helpful it is and how it makes possible things that would otherwise not be possible. So it's been fantastic to get a chance to take a look at what you've done and to ask you questions about it and to learn from it. We really, really appreciate you coming and talking with us today.